You wake up on a straw-stuffed mattress that smells faintly of damp goat and last week's cabbage. Congratulations, you've been reincarnated as a peasant in 13th century England. Or France. Or possibly somewhere that still thinks bathing is suspicious, and that sneezing is probably a demonic issue. You are not well rested. That much is immediately clear. Something bit you during the night, probably a flea, or a rat, or your cousin who lives under the bed. You look around the dim interior of your wooden hut/hygiene experiment, and the first thing you see is your mother tying a bundle of dried herbs, feathers, and teeth around your neck. She says it's to ward off evil spirits. Or scrofula. Or Mondays. You're not sure. You blink. She looks serious. This isn't an aesthetic choice. This is medicine. Or maybe it's magic. Maybe it's both. So before you curl up under your scratchy wool blanket and drift off to dream of modern plumbing, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy listening to me ramble about ancient suffering and cursed jewelry. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what ungodly hour it is there. It's genuinely wild to see how many of us are just wide awake at 3 a.m., pretending this is normal. Right. Let's get into it. The Middle Ages were a golden age of being terrified of everything. You feared illness. You feared famine. You feared your neighbor's chicken. You feared the weather, which was mostly rain and plagues. But most of all, you feared invisible things. Spirits, demons, sin, God's temper, your mother-in-law's gaze. And that fear? It came accessorized. You see, in a time where most of the population was illiterate, and science involved throwing leeches at problems until they went away or your patient died, whichever came first, people turned to charms and amulets. These weren't just trinkets. These were insurance policies for your immortal soul. And for your liver. And your crops. You, for example, are currently wearing a rabbit's foot, which ironically didn't help the rabbit. It's supposed to protect you from the evil eye. Not that you know what the evil eye is, but you're absolutely convinced someone at church gave it to you last week when they complimented your turnips. Suspicious. Your mother keeps a pouch of dried mouse bones in the rafters. That's for fertility. Or migraines. Or possibly to keep mice away through some deeply ironic form of sympathetic magic. Honestly, the logic isn't always linear. Let's be clear. In medieval Europe, everyone was operating under a daily barrage of threats that would make a modern anxiety attack look like a spa day. There's no Google. No ibuprofen. No indoor heating. Just faith. And pockets full of talismans. Some of them were religious, like little wooden crucifixes, blessed by that one monk who definitely smells like onions and regret. Others were much older, drawing from pagan traditions that the church said were deeply heretical, but also kinda useful when your cow wouldn't produce milk and you were 3 bad omens away from starvation. There's also a dried mole's foot nailed above your door. That's to stop witches from coming in. Apparently witches hate mole feet. Who knew? And yes, of course you believe in witches. Everyone does. Your neighbor Agnes got accused of being one because her bread rose a little too well, which clearly means she made a pact with Satan. She now lives in the forest with a goat named Jeremy and no teeth. Now, let's take a gentle detour into the world of pilgrim souvenirs, which were the medieval equivalent of fridge magnets, except instead of saying, "I red heart Jerusalem," they were believed to contain sacred power. You might wear a pewter badge shaped like the Virgin Mary sandal, allegedly touched by her actual foot. Sure. Why not? It probably smells like sanctity and first-century desert dust. Pilgrims collected these badges on long, blister-inducing walks across Europe, seeking divine protection. Bonus points if the badge came from a saint's tomb. Extra bonus points if it touched the saint's actual bones. Triple bonus if the saint had been martyred in some impressively gory fashion, ideally involving lions, fire, or some kind of inventive medieval cutlery. There was a whole market, literally, for this stuff. Picture medieval street vendors selling reliquaries with more hustle than your local used car dealer. This one has a real saint's kneecap. Blessed twice. Only 3 shillings. You glance down at your belt pouch. Inside, you've got a pebble from St. James's Shrine, a bit of cloth from a holy shroud that looks suspiciously like it came from someone's laundry, and a dried frog, which you don't remember acquiring, but now seems like a crucial part of your health regimen. You feel spiritually protected. Or mildly cursed. The line is blurry. Now let's talk about childbirth. which in the Middle Ages was, let's just say, statistically inadvisable. Between infections, fevers, and a general lack of understanding about anything involving blood, childbirth was often fatal. So naturally, women carried special birthing charms. Tiny scrolls of prayers, engraved rings, holy salts, amulets tucked under pillows. Anything to bribe the universe into not killing you on the way to motherhood. Midwives even used written charms. Some of these were prayers folded into geometric shapes and placed under the laboring woman's mattress. Others included literal birth girdles, long parchment rolls decorated with protective imagery and saintly invocations, which women would wrap around their stomachs like divine seatbelts. Did it help? Well, you're here, so someone survived. Maybe the girdle worked. Maybe the plague took a lunch break. Even kings weren't above magical accessorizing. Henry VIII, yes, that guy, wore an amulet to ward off sweating sickness. It didn't work, obviously, but he tried. He also blamed everything from headaches to miscarriages on being cursed. Because that's what you do when you're a 500-year-old man-child with a crown and a sword. You blame ghosts. And speaking of ghosts, let's not forget funerary amulets. You're at your great-aunt's burial. She's being buried with a wax tablet that contains a prayer against judgment. It's supposed to keep her safe during the Last Judgment, which is essentially a divine performance review. She's also got a little pouch of blessed earth. 4 reasons. You're not asking questions. Now, let's rewind a little to the early Christian period. The church had opinions about charms and amulets. And by opinions, I mean they called most of them witchcraft. Except when they didn't. The line between pagan superstition and acceptable devotion was mostly based on whether the charm had a cross on it and whether the local priest got a cut of the sale. You might be excommunicated for carrying a lunar pendant, but if it's shaped like a dove and blessed by Father Barnabas, suddenly it's fine. Welcome to spiritual loopholes. Amulets were also gendered. Men tended to carry protective symbols related to war, status, or travel, like tokens blessed by St. George, patron saint of dragon murder. Women's charms were focused on fertility, safe childbirth, and not dying in your 30s, which was basically the medieval equivalent of retirement. Now let's take a cozy little nap in a less cozy time period, the Black Death. When the plague rolled into town, like the world's worst party guest, people clung to anything that offered a shred of protection. Amulets, herbs, prayers, dead weasels, you name it. One popular item, a posy of flowers or aromatic herbs carried around the neck to ward off miasma. You know, bad air. The same bad air theory that told doctors to wear giant bird masks filled with herbs looking like depressed goth pelicans. You also might have worn a scrap of text from the Book of Psalms, which people believe could keep plague demons away, or at least distract them. Oh no, he's quoting scripture. Let's go infect someone else. Your town healer, who may or may not be an actual doctor, sells you a charm made from crushed emerald and wolf's teeth. It's expensive. It's weird. You wear it anyway. The logic behind all of this, sympathetic magic, religious faith, desperation-fueled fashion choices, is rooted in survival. People didn't carry charms because they were bored. They carried them because life was terrifying, short, and full of things they didn't understand. And when you don't have answers, you carry a hedgehog tooth and hope it works. You wake up to the sound of something chewing. It's either a rat gnawing on your shoe or your cousin gnawing on a rat. Again. Either way, you're awake, it's the 14th century, and your face is covered in a mysterious rash that your grandmother insists is caused by moon vapors. You believe her, mostly because she's holding a dead badger's paw and staring at you like she knows something you don't. Your hut smells like damp straw, onion breath, and the faint but persistent whiff of regret. It's comforting, in a way. You sit up slowly, bones creaking like poorly maintained church doors, and reach for your protective charm. The one you were told to never, ever take off unless you wanted your chickens to start speaking Latin and floating 3 feet off the ground. That charm? It's a small, leathery pouch stuffed with holy verses, a clump of dried lavender, a broken coin, and the molar of your long-dead Uncle Bernard. For luck. You're starting to think Bernard wasn't all that lucky. Let's get into it. By now, you've probably realized that medieval folks weren't just carrying charms and amulets because they liked jangling when they walked. These things were part spiritual insurance, part healthcare, part medieval swag. People weren't just hoping for divine protection, they were curating a collection. And it could get competitive. Imagine your neighbor strutting into mass with a brand new pewter pendant blessed by 2 different monks, while you're still wearing your old cord necklace that smells like mutton stew and disappointment. She raises an eyebrow. You feel judged. You go home and immediately start looking for a new relic dealer with better connections to St. Barbara. This wasn't just spiritual. It was social. The more elaborate your protective gear, the more it said about you. Look at me, your amulet whispers. I'm deeply pious, subtly wealthy, and moderately terrified of demons. A classic medieval vibe. But let's take a little journey outside your moldy cottage and into the village green, where old Marjorie is swearing that her cow is possessed. This isn't sarcasm. She genuinely believes it. The cow won't produce milk, and it's been staring at her in a weirdly judgmental way. What do? You don't call a vet. Those haven't been invented. You call the local cunning man, or cunning woman, or wise one. Or, if you're not on good terms, witch. He arrives wearing too many layers, smelling of fermented roots and maybe regret, carrying a sack filled with charms, bones, herbs, and what you hope is a dead chicken and not his lunch. He circles the cow, mumbles a prayer, spits, then ties a string of garlic around the cow's neck and places a stone carved with runes under her trough. You don't understand what's happening, but you nod sagely and pretend you do. You feel better. The cow still looks angry, but at least it's not floating. Yet. Here's the thing. The line between magic, religion, and medicine in the Middle Ages was, how do I put this delicately? Non-existent. It was all just one big mystical soup. People believed in everything because they had nothing. No science. No hospitals. Just fear, hope, and things you could wear around your neck. Let's pause and talk about the absolute chaos that was medieval medical theory. First off, there were humors, 4 bodily fluids that allegedly dictated your personality, health, and likelihood of dying from a stub toe. You've got blood, cheerful, phlegm, lazy, yellow bile, angry, and black bile, depressed. You're probably full of all of them, and definitely not in balance. If you were sick, a doctor might prescribe a charm, or a poultice made from mashed frogs, or leeches, or amulets, or, if things were really bad, trepanning, which is a fancy word for let's drill a hole in your skull and hope the demons fly out. Not into cranial air conditioning? No problem. Just wear a ring inscribed with a verse from the Gospel of John. Or carry a splinter from the true cross, which, judging by how many existed, the true cross must have been the size of a small continent. And that badger's paw? Surprisingly versatile. It could ward off toothaches, nightmares, curses, aggressive chickens, and sometimes, if you rubbed it in the right direction, help with love spells. Yes, love spells were a thing. Because apparently, nothing says romance like chanting in Latin while burying a pigeon skull under someone's doorstep. Now let's talk about hair. People used hair in charms constantly. You might keep a lock of your beloved's hair in a pouch near your heart. Sweet, right? Until you find out your rival stole some and used it in a binding charm, and now your beloved won't stop hiccuping and staring at walls. You think I'm exaggerating, but hair was seen as deeply connected to a person's essence. That's why people would freak out if a lock went missing. It could be used against you. Like the medieval version of identity theft, except instead of hacking your bank account, someone gives you incurable hiccups and an overwhelming fear of geese. Let's shift over to the topic of saints' relics, which, frankly, was the medieval version of Pokemon. Gotta collect them all. Churches would fiercely compete to claim they had the skull, finger, or oddly preserved spleen of some saint or other. Pilgrims flocked to them in the hope that touching the relic, or even just being in the same room, would cure their ailments, lift their curses, or get their soul fast-tracked through purgatory. You, naturally, have a small vial of St. Cuthbert's toe sweat hanging around your neck. You're not sure if it's real. You're not even sure toes sweat. But it's supposed to help with back pain, and your back has been making snapping noises every time you carry water, so you're willing to believe. There were also written charms. Medieval people believed that the physical presence of holy words had power, even if they couldn't read them. You might carry a folded scrap of parchment inscribed with scripture, prayers, or protective symbols. Never mind that you're illiterate. The letters themselves are magic, like alphabet-shaped force fields. Some people took this a step further and wore entire books around their necks. Tiny books, booklets, Salters. Imagine walking around with your Kindle strapped to your chest, except it only contains religious chants and smells faintly of sheep. Now, if you lived near water, rivers, lakes, moats, you might carry charms specifically designed to prevent drowning. That might sound oddly specific until you realize how many people in the Middle Ages couldn't swim. Boats were more enthusiastic than stable, and bridges were more suggestion than structure. These anti-drowning charms were sometimes shaped like fish, or anchors, or bits of coral, which were believed to have protective powers. Sailors in particular were amulet collectors on par with modern grandmas and refrigerator magnets. St. Christopher medals were popular, as were small carvings of ships, ropes, or mariners' knots tied with symbolic meaning. Now let's get intimate. No, not like that. There were charms for, let's say, romantic success. Fertility charms. Passion charms. Please don't die during sex charms. Some were subtle, herbs tucked into clothing, whispered prayers. Others were frankly bizarre, like drinking wine that had a ring of Venus dunked in it, or tying beetle legs to your undergarments. The Middle Ages were very imaginative. One of the more charming practices was to write down a spell, fold it up, and swallow it. Yes, swallow the charm, with water, or wine, or hope, usually to cure illness or heartbreak or indigestion caused by last night's questionable pottage. Did it work? Probably not. But it gave people something to do, which in a time without TikTok or therapy, was half the battle. Now we'll take a moment to appreciate the traveling charm sellers. Yes, they existed. Part merchant, part mystic, part con artist. They would show up at markets hawking wares that allegedly protected against toothaches, witchcraft, bad harvests, awkward dinner guests, and yes, even hangovers. Because medieval people definitely knew how to drink. And regret. You once bought a charm from one of these sellers. He told you it was made from moonstone and fox breath. You later found out it was just a shiny rock tied to a shoelace. But by then, your headache had gone away, so you decided to believe. That's the thing about these amulets. Belief was part of the magic. The placebo effect? Alive and well in the Middle Ages. People genuinely felt better when they wore their charms. And in a world where hope was rare and danger was constant, that feeling was worth its weight in dried mole feet. You wake up in someone else's barn. Again. It's hard to say exactly whose barn this is, mainly because it's still dark, you're surrounded by goats, and there's a wheelbarrow balanced on your foot. But one thing is clear, you're definitely wearing someone else's boots. They're 2 sizes too small and have property of Brother Elric carved into the sole. Which is odd, since Brother Elric has taken a vow of poverty and walks everywhere barefoot. So, that's a problem for later. For now, you reach inside your tunic and check to make sure your amulet is still there. The familiar lump of cloth, silver, and old string comforts you. You mutter a quiet thank you to St. Leonard, or maybe it's St. Wilgefortis. You get your saints mixed up, which is understandable, since half of them are named Saint something of somewhere with a suffering-based backstory. Anyway, you survived the night, probably avoided demon possession, and didn't choke on rats in your sleep. That's a win. But let's talk about something a little more stylish, accessories. Specifically, the fact that in the Middle Ages, your accessories could get you killed. You see, fashion wasn't just fashion. Jewelry, belts, brooches, rings, all of it could be enchanted, blessed, or, if you were unlucky, cursed. And unlike today, there was no returns policy. You couldn't exactly walk back into ye old Hex Emporium and demand a refund because your bracelet made your cows cry blood. Let's begin with rings. Not the fun, proposal on a hilltop kind. No, we're talking about my fingers are turning green, but at least the evil I can't find me kind. Rings were among the most popular types of magical protection. You'd have engraved rings with Latin inscriptions, pseudo-Greek symbols, and lines from apocryphal gospels you definitely couldn't pronounce. Some had gemstones with supposed properties, amethyst for sobriety, sapphire for purity, garnet to ward off the plague, and onyx to stop you from talking too much. You wore that one to family dinners. And if you couldn't afford precious stones? No problem. Glass worked too. As long as it sparkled, looked vaguely mystical, and smelled only mildly cursed, it counted. Now, here's the fun part. Many of these rings were passed down through generations. Grandpa died? Quick, take his fingering before the corpse stiffens. You need that protection more than he does. But sometimes, those heirlooms came with baggage. Ever worn a ring that gave you nightmares? Or maybe it whispered in your sleep. Or maybe every time you put it on, your bread won't rise and your dog starts singing hymns backwards? Congratulations. You've inherited a cursed ring. But fear not. You could fix it by getting it re-blessed or having a priest boil it in holy water. Yes, this was an actual thing. Holy water boiling was not just a purification method, it was a weekend activity. You'd bring your possessed belongings, drop them in a bubbling cauldron of divine broth, say a few prayers, and hope your jewelry didn't scream. Now, let's talk about belts. Not exactly the sexiest piece of mystical equipment, but trust me, they were serious business. Belts held more than your pants, they held power. Knights would wear enchanted sword belts, inscribed with charms to protect them in battle. Midwives wore birthing girdles, carefully embroidered with prayers to ensure safe deliveries. And merchants? They had belts with secret pouches containing coins, herbs, and the occasional magical beetle. You, of course, wear a belt made from braided goat leather with a small carved charm hanging from the buckle. It's supposed to ward off back pain and tax collectors. Neither has worked so far, but hope springs eternal. Some belts were engraved with the names of angels. Not the kind you see on Christmas cards. We're talking the strange ones, the ones from obscure biblical footnotes, with names like Raziel, Uriel, and that one angel with the 7 flaming eyes. Wearing their names was meant to give you divine protection. Or, if nothing else, confuse the person trying to rob you. Now let's move on to brooches. Brooches were the medieval version of both statement necklaces and home security systems. They fasten your cloak and told the world, "Don't mess with me, I have celestial backup." One popular design? A brooch in the shape of a hand, often with 2 fingers extended in blessing or warning. People believed these could protect against illness, gossip, and sudden death, 3 of the most common medieval inconveniences. Another favorite? The pseudo-Islamic brooch. These were made in Christian Europe, but mimicked Arabic calligraphy because nobody knew how to read Arabic and everyone thought it looked super mystical. It's the medieval equivalent of getting a tattoo in Japanese characters that says strength but actually translates to leftover soup. Let's not forget the necklaces. Necklaces could contain tiny relics, fragments of saints' bones, miniature books, or even entire prayers etched on grains of rice. Yes, medieval monks had that kind of time. Some were filled with powdered herbs or dirt from holy sites, like Jerusalem, or more realistically, Jerusalemish back alleys with strong branding. One particularly cursed story involves a woman who wore a necklace made from a wolf's tooth, blessed by a monk who later turned out to be possessed himself. Within a week, her goats went blind and her husband started humming Gregorian chants in his sleep. She eventually buried the necklace under a yew tree and moved 3 villages over. Solid plan, honestly. And now, a word about swords. If you're lucky or suicidal, you might own one. But it's not just a weapon. It's your soul. Swords were engraved with blessings, saints' names, and sometimes entire psalms. Why? Because the only thing scarier than charging into battle is charging into battle without divine Wi-Fi. Some knights even named their swords, usually something dramatic like Mercy Giver or Demon Cleaver or Roger. Engraving the sword with holy inscriptions was set to not only protect the knight, but ensure the weapon wouldn't rust, break, or accidentally slice the family dog during practice. Now, you may be asking, where did people get these charms and magical accessories? Good question. Sometimes they were crafted by local monks, scribes, or cunning folk, basically anyone literate, reclusive, and slightly terrifying. Other times they were bought at fairs, pilgrimages, or from traveling charm sellers who claimed their goods were blessed by the Pope, the Virgin Mary, or a passing angel who didn't want to talk about it. And then there were blacksmiths who made magical gear on commission. For the right price, they'd forge a belt buckle that kept away scurvy, or a hairpin that allegedly made you more fertile, or, most famously, a pair of enchanted spurs that would never slip unless the wearer was a liar, in which case, tough luck. You, naturally, once commissioned a protective toenail clipper. It broke after 2 uses. You're still bitter. Of course, none of this was strictly approved by the church. In theory, you were supposed to trust in God, not in goat tooth necklaces or owl bone earrings. But in practice, Even priests carried charms. Secretly, of course. Tucked inside their robes. You know, just in case the devil decided to stop by for tea and a light soul-stealing. The line between faith and superstition was very, very blurry. So where does that leave you? Well, you've got 3 brooches, 2 rings, 1 questionable belt, a pouch full of dried lavender, a leather necklace with a saint's fingernail, probably, and a recurring dream about fire-breathing hens. All normal. All fine. You wear your amulets not because you expect them to work, necessarily, but because not wearing them feels wrong. Exposed. Like leaving the house without pants. Sure, you might survive. But why risk it? Besides, if something terrible happens, and something always does, you want to at least be able to say, well, I did wear the wolf-tooth necklace and carry the holy pebble. I don't know what more the spirits want from me. You wake up in a field. Why? Because your cousin said he saw a glowing rabbit with antlers near the riverbank and dared you to chase it. You did. You always do. And now here you are, curled around a suspicious pile of reeds, with dew in your boots and a headache shaped like regret. The good news, the rabbit was probably imaginary. The bad news, you're fairly certain you slept on something cursed. You sit up and feel around your neck for your herbal sachet, the little linen pouch stuffed with dried herbs, tied with red thread, and blessed by a woman who may or may not have once married a tree. Ah, still there. Still smells like swampy oregano and a whisper of old feet. Today, we're diving nose first into the green and fragrant world of herbal amulets and magical plants. Yes, it's time to talk about how medieval people wandered into the woods, found whatever was growing, and then rubbed it on themselves hoping it would cure fevers, stop demons, or make their cows respect them. Let's begin with a fan favorite, mint. Mint was the Beyoncé of medieval herbs. It was used for everything. You had a headache? Mint. Toothache? Mint. Demonic dreams involving fish and Latin? Definitely mint. It was believed to cool the blood, purify the air, and, most importantly, repel evil spirits. So, of course, people wore it. Around the neck. Tucked into shoes. Sewn into hats. A small bouquet of mint dangling from your belt was practically a sign saying, I'm not cursed. Please don't hex me. Did it work? No. Obviously not. But it smelled nice. And in a time when most people bathed twice a year and thought garlic counted as deodorant, that alone made you magical. Speaking of garlic, let's talk about garlic. Garlic was the poor man's holy water. You didn't just eat it. You wore it, hung it in your house, rubbed it on your doors, and, if things got really desperate, tucked a clove into your armpits during church. Yes, the smell of divine protection was basically medieval Axe body spray. Garlic was believed to repel illness, envy, the evil eye, and possibly your in-laws. It was one of the most common ingredients in amulets and protective charms. And unlike mint, it wasn't subtle. A person wearing garlic made an announcement, I am deeply afraid of demons, and also I don't care if you vomit from being near me. Let's go deeper into the herb pile. Rue. Rue was known as the herb of grace. Not because it made you graceful, oh no, you still tripped over rocks and your own dignity, but because it was supposed to protect you from witches. People believed witches couldn't cross a threshold lined with rue. Which was awkward if you were a witch and happened to be late for dinner. Wearing a sprig of rue behind your ear or inside your hat was the medieval equivalent of antivirus software. Completely useless, but very comforting. Then there was wormwood. Not to be confused with wood filled with worms, though that was also a common medieval snack. Wormwood was bitter, pungent, and believed to fight off both intestinal parasites and demonic possession. Those two things were weirdly interchangeable back then. People didn't fully understand digestion. So if you vomited blood and heard voices, they assumed either your dinner was undercooked or Satan had moved into your liver. So naturally, wormwood was sewn into protective sachets, mixed into potions, and sometimes sprinkled in the bath. The bath you took every equinox. Vervain was another magical darling. Associated with ancient druids, this herb was said to protect against sorcery, lightning strikes, and general bad vibes. It was used in love charms, purification rituals, and, according to at least one French grimoire, could keep your chickens from getting depressed. And let's not forget St. John's wort, the original medieval antidepressant. People wore it to drive away melancholy, which is just a very 14th century way of saying, I feel like death, and the sky hates me. They also believed it could protect you from ghost possession, especially if picked on Midsummer's Eve by a virgin who hadn't spoken for 3 days. So, good luck with that sourcing. Now, how did you carry all these plants? Good question. You didn't just grab a handful of mint and stick it under your armpit. Well, you could. But more often, you made a herbal amulet, a small cloth or leather pouch filled with dried herbs, sometimes mixed with hair, fingernails, salt, or bits of written prayers. Tied with colored thread, usually red or black, and worn close to the skin. Each ingredient had a specific vibe. Salt was for purification. Hair for binding. Prayers were like little celestial bribes. You'd wear this thing every day, never wash it, and maybe replace the herbs once every 3 years, assuming you lived that long. They smelled like hope. Or mildew. Same thing in the 1300s. Of course, not everyone was content with sachets. Some people made protective potions, concoctions of herbs, wine, honey, and sometimes animal parts, all boiled in a pot and chanted over until they were charged with magical energy. Let's walk through one. Imagine it's a Wednesday. Your neighbor claims a demon is sitting on her roof, making her goats walk backwards. You offer to help. You collect the following: 3 mint leaves, a pinch of rue, a clove of garlic, dried frog heart, a little wine, a prayer written backwards, 1 fingernail clipping, not yours, never yours. You boil this mess while chanting a psalm. Then you bottle it in a ceramic jar, mark it with a symbol, a star, a fish, a screaming skull, dealer's choice, and bury it under her front doorstep. Did it work? Not really. But the demon got bored and wandered off. So, success? Another favorite protection method was burning herbs in the home. Yes, medieval smudging. Especially popular during plagues. People would walk around with bundles of herbs on fire, waving them like flaming pom-poms, trying to smoke out evil spirits, or at least the smell of decomposing rats. Juniper, lavender, thyme, and bay leaves were common choices. You'd wave them around like a frantic wizard, coughing slightly, muttering something about Saint Sebastian, and hoping your neighbors didn't accuse you of witchcraft for knowing too much about plants. It was a delicate balance. Be mystical enough to survive, but not so mystical that you get set on fire. And we haven't even talked about bodily plant placements. Oh yes, if you were particularly paranoid, you might tuck herbs into the following: your shoes, to avoid blisters and curses; your undergarments, to stay chaste or at least itch-free; your mattress, to keep dreams peaceful and spirits uninterested; your bread, to protect your digestion and anger no fairies. Basically, medieval life was a cross between a cooking show and a horror movie. You never knew which plant might save you, or accidentally summon a goat with human eyes. And where did you get all these herbs? From the hedge witch. Every village had one. Usually a woman, old, wearing 5 shawls at once, smelled like onions and prophecy. She knew which leaf cured colic, which root banished nightmares, and which berry you should never, ever eat unless you wanted to see angels playing dice with your liver. People came to her quietly. At night. With coins and chickens. She never smiled, and she always knew what you needed before you asked. You went to her once. Asked for something to stop the night terrors. She gave you a pouch of herbs, told you to sleep with it under your pillow, and never, ever, open it. You haven't. You won't. Not after what happened to that other guy who did. So what have we learned? Medieval people carried herbs like they were currency. They trusted plants more than doctors, because frankly, the doctors were insane and thought headaches were caused by wind in your bones. Herbs were tangible, comforting, and, unlike people, they didn't scream when you burned them. Even if the herbs didn't actually protect you from demons, illness, or envy, they made you feel like you had control. Like you weren't just flailing in the dark, waiting for the next bad thing to fall from the sky. And that's kind of beautiful. You lie back down in the grass. The mint sachet still hangs from your neck. You breathe in its stale, peppery scent. You close your eyes and wonder if the rabbit was real. Probably not. But you'll keep wearing the herbs. You wake up scratching. It's not bed bugs, or fleas, or lice, or the ghost of that cursed pillow you stole from the abbey. No, today's discomfort is coming from inside the shirt. Because, congratulations, you're wearing what's known in the 13th century fashion scene as a protective tunic. It's itchy. It smells like dried goat breath. And it's probably made from wool so coarse it could exfoliate your sins. But don't worry. That rash on your ribs? It's holy. Welcome to the wonderful, chafing world of protective garments, where fashion meets faith and every sleeve might be enchanted. See, long before blessed merch was something you bought from an influencer shop, medieval folks were sewing divine protection right into their clothing. Literal wearable spells. People believed evil spirits could enter through your skin, so obviously the solution was clothing, with words on it. Let's start with the big one, the prayer shirt. The prayer shirt, or shirt of charms, was a linen or wool undershirt, often rough, often uncomfortable, inscribed with Latin prayers, religious symbols, or magical formulas. If you were rich, a monk or priest might do the writing. If you were poor, your cousin with a shaky grasp of Latin and half a quill might give it a shot. Did it protect you? Of course not. But did people believe it did? Absolutely. One of the most popular designs was to stitch or write the Paternoster, Lord's Prayer, around the collar and cuffs, because everyone knew demons respected boundaries, especially when they were hand-embroidered. Some people went full chaos mode and stitched entire psalms onto the sleeves. Others added magical sigils, biblical names, or protective numerology. A popular one? Abgar, Abgaroth, Absalom, names that sounded mystical and probably didn't belong to any real saints. But hey, it's the effort that counts. So before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to see who's out there drifting off to the sound of medieval undergarments. Now, let's talk layers. A protective shirt was usually worn close to the skin underneath all your other clothes. Not because it was comfortable. No, comfort didn't exist. It was layered there because the closer to your flesh it was, the more likely it could block demonic entry. Think of it like spiritual chainmail, except itchy, sweaty, and completely ineffective. Some people added herbs to their garments. Yes, you could be walking around in a tunic stuffed with wormwood, rue, or mugwort, which sounds like a Harry Potter character but was very real and very bitter smelling. These herbs were sewn into little pockets or woven into the seams, creating a constant, walking spell. And if you're wondering, wait, wouldn't that attract insects? Yes, it did. But according to medieval logic, if the bugs were coming for you, the demons weren't. A win is a win. Then there's the belt of protection. These belts were worn under your clothes and were often made from leather or linen. On them, you'd find more prayers, sometimes entire gospels written in microscopic letters. That's right, someone squinted over a strip of goat hide and wrote down the book of Matthew just so you could walk to the market without catching a plague. Some belts included saint names, like Saint Barbara, good for thunderstorms, Saint Christopher, travel protection, or Saint Apollonia, dental pain, obviously. Occasionally, these belts were kissed by monks before being worn, which means somewhere out there was a monk who had to pucker up to your waistband. Blessed are the mildly repulsed. You also had leg bands, narrow strips of cloth tied around your thighs or calves, believed to keep you from collapsing mysteriously in the street, which often meant either divine punishment or, you guessed it, demons again. There were also magic socks. Yes, magic socks. These were rarely comfortable, usually wool, always tight, but supposedly protected your feet from being cursed. Because a cursed foot was a real problem, limping could be interpreted as a sign of demonic favor. Or worse, French. These socks might have symbols stitched onto the soles or tuck herbs hidden in the heels. If you were wealthy, someone might have embroidered angel names onto the toes, which is oddly adorable, actually. Now, let's talk about hats. Hats weren't just for warmth or head lice prevention, though, bonus. No, a properly charmed cap could protect your mind. Because if a demon got into your brain, it could make you say weird things, dream badly, or, God forbid, start writing poetry. So people wore blessed caps, often knitted or stitched with phrases like Sanctus Dominus or simply Jesus repeated over and over like a theological security alarm. In Germany, some children were given protective bonnets with prayers stitched across the crown. These hats were meant to guard against seizures, fevers, and witches stealing your thoughts, which is the medieval version of worrying your kid's been hacked by Instagram. Want to get extra weird? Let's go south. To your underwear. Yes, People believed even your groin needed divine help. Because we're better for a demon to attack than your lustful bits. Underclothes, if you were rich enough to own them, might be blessed by clergy or marked with symbols to preserve chastity, protect against temptation, or keep you safe from sudden swelling, which could mean anything from hernia to romantic inconvenience. If you were particularly paranoid, you might carry a charm stitched into your underlayer, right over the belly. These were supposed to help digestion and protect the womb, if applicable. There are actual medieval documents describing cloth undergarments inscribed with prayers for warding off nightly emissions, which is about as personal as spell work gets. Now let's not forget shoes. Shoes weren't just foot coverings. They were transportation for your soul. So naturally, protective charms were sometimes hidden in the soles. People would literally bury texts or symbols inside their boots to step on evil as they walked. You know what that makes them? Holy insoles. But perhaps the most dramatic of all medieval protective clothing wasn't what you wore daily. It was what you put on in moments of crisis, the shirt of penance. You'd wear this during plague outbreaks, demon possessions, or moments of extreme spiritual guilt. Usually made of coarse fabric, sometimes even hair shirts, these garments were worn not to protect you physically, but to spiritually purify you through discomfort. If it hurt to wear, that meant it was working. Itchy? Good. You're becoming holy. Sweating and sobbing into a tunic lined with verses from the book of Job? Perfect. God loves that. And let's be honest, if suffering counted as spiritual currency, the medieval people were filthy rich. Did these protective clothes work? No, of course not. But they made people feel safer. And in a world where the Black Death could show up faster than your ex during Lent, a little security blanket, even one that scratched, was worth it. And here's the twist. Half the time, people didn't even know what was stitched into their shirts. Some garments were passed down like heirlooms. You could be wearing a linen undershirt that said, "Go away, Satan," in faded ink, and just assume it was your great-aunt's gardening shirt. Still, there's something strangely comforting in the idea that every thread could be a prayer, that a sleeve could be a shield, that your itchy woolen socks might be doing something other than giving you fungal anxiety. So tonight, as you settle into bed, think about that. Think about what it might feel like to pull on a shirt of charms, tie a belt of saints around your waist, and walk into the fog, fully dressed in your own quiet armor. Because sure, the demons might still come. But at least you'll look fabulous. You wake up in a field. You're not sure how you got here. You're wearing one shoe, your other foot is bleeding slightly, and there's a toad sitting on your chest. The toad seems judgmental. There's also a priest standing about 10 feet away. He's muttering something in Latin while waving what looks like a dead chicken tied to a string. A small crowd of townsfolk watches in reverent silence as he circles you 3 times, spits into the grass, and then sets your hat on fire. Congratulations. You're in the middle of a charm activation ritual. Because back in the medieval world, it wasn't enough to just own a charm or amulet. Oh no, that's amateur hour. You had to wake it up. Turn it on, in a way that often involved equal parts prayer, bodily fluid, and questionable choices. Let's begin with something nice and simple, spitting. Yes, spitting. Turns out, medieval people considered spitting to be a powerful spiritual tool. Why? Well, partly because they thought bodily fluids were conduits of power, sort of like plugging your iPhone into an old, damp wall socket. And partly because it just made sense in their worldview. Evil forces could enter the body through the mouth, so it stood to reason that you could expel them the same way. So naturally, activating your charm often began with hawking a loogie. 3 times, to be exact. Spit 3 times on the charm to awaken its power, said several grimy manuscripts that definitely smelled like mildew and goat. And not just any spit. It had to be morning spit, before you spoke to anyone, before you ate, before you brushed your teeth, which, let's be honest, you weren't doing anyway. Apparently, morning breath had spiritual potency. Which means yes, your halitosis was sacred. Another favorite method? Whispering to the charm. People genuinely believed that charms responded better if you spoke to them. Like plants. Or very dumb cats. You'd whisper the name of a saint, or recite a prayer directly into the object, sometimes with your mouth pressed right up against it, which was charmingly intimate and wildly unhygienic. Some even insisted the charm must be breathed on, preferably with a little puff of warm air, because it mimicked the divine breath of creation. There are recorded instructions for how to properly whisper to a piece of iron so it would guard against night spirits. You had to hold it under a full moon, whisper the phrase Sata or Repo Tenet Opera Rotas, and then not speak to anyone else for an hour. Which is basically the medieval version of ghosting your whole village for a spiritual firmware update. So before we go any deeper into bizarre rituals involving frogs, blood, and sacred geometry carved into bread, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, if, and only if, you find yourself actually enjoying these sleepy descents into historical chaos. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, especially if you're lying awake wondering whether your pillow needs a protective chant. Now let's talk about ritual bathing. You might assume that this involved cleanliness. It did not. Some charms, especially those intended to ward off disease or infertility, required the user to bathe the charm in special water. Holy water was ideal, but in a pinch, you could use water from a sacred spring, a pond struck by lightning, or water that had been used to wash a relic. Yes, used water. One ritual recommends that the charm be soaked in water touched by the toe of a saint, which raises several questions and none of them pleasant. The bather would then chant a psalm, usually Psalm 91, the one about God protecting you from the terror by night, which is poetic and also vaguely threatening, and sprinkle the bath water over themselves, their livestock, and sometimes their doorframes. If you're wondering whether people ever accidentally drowned their own amulets, yes. Yes, they did. Archaeologists have found hundreds of small, engraved pendants sitting at the bottoms of wells, streams, and church fonts, presumably still waiting to be charged. Let's move on to rituals involving fire. Because what could possibly go wrong? Fire was considered purifying. It could burn away evil influences, both literal and metaphorical. So, to activate some charms, particularly those etched onto metal, people would heat the object over a flame while chanting. Sometimes the charm had to be passed through 9 flames, not 8, not 10. 9. Because 9 was a holy number. The Trinity of Trinities. The medieval equivalent of hitting accept all cookies. In other cases, the charm would be placed in the fireplace during a storm, specifically to catch the thunder's strength. And yes, people did occasionally burn their own houses down trying to make a lightning-proof necklace. But the real magic started when you involved animals. Let's talk about the toad in the wall. One of the most bizarre charm rituals involved catching a toad, preferably alive, stuffing it with herbs, sewing it shut, and then sealing it into the wall of your house. This would protect the home from lightning, plague, or your neighbor Margaret's gossip. Other animal-related rituals include burying a black cat's whisker with your charm to strengthen its power, using the left foot of a hare killed at midnight only on a Tuesday, washing the charm in milk from a firstborn goat, wrapping it in sheep wool soaked in menstrual blood. Yes, really, apologies if you were drifting off peacefully just now. And then, of course, there was bloodletting. Some rituals required a gift of blood to awaken a charm. Usually, this meant a small prick to the finger. Other times, it meant significantly more. There's a 14th century charm book that includes the phrase, "Mix the blood with ashen wine, and paint the sigil upon thy chest." Romantic, right? Unfortunately, it was rarely your blood. Yes, some activation rituals involved animal blood or even sacrificial birds. In Germany, one charm recommends smearing bat blood on your windowsill to guard against spirits of the air. Which is probably the only time anyone said, "Quick, grab the bat blood," with a straight face. You also had rituals involving bread and salt. Charms were sometimes baked into bread and eaten, because, obviously, the best place for sacred protection is inside your small intestine. One tradition claimed that if you ate bread marked with the name of the Archangel Michael on St. Michael's Day, you would be protected from sword wounds. Spoiler, you would not. There are dozens of examples of charms being buried in loaves, cakes, or dumplings. One Scottish recipe from the 1400s instructs you to bake the name of God into the crust using a wooden stamp. Then feed the bread to your cows to prevent their milk from curdling. Because obviously, evil spirits love ruining dairy. Then you had astrological timing. Activating a charm had to be done under the right moon, or star, or planetary alignment. You couldn't just activate your charm whenever you felt like it. That would be chaos. No, it had to be on the 3rd hour after sunrise, on the 3rd day of the waxing moon, When Venus is in Capricorn and the wind is blowing from the east but not too strongly, or else the spell would backfire and you'd develop boils on your feet. Obviously, there are surviving texts that include full astrological tables just for picking the right charm activation date. Some even recommend consulting a wise woman with knowledge of the heavenly paths, which is code for the local lady who smells like elderberry and has a suspicious number of teeth. And of course, we mustn't forget the power of silence. Silence was sacred. Once you activated your charm, whether by breath, spit, fire, or goat-based drama, you often had to keep silent for a set period, usually 3 hours, sometimes until sunset, occasionally for 3 days. Yes, 3 days of silence, in a village, with livestock, and bells, and that one neighbor who never stops complaining about the weather. If you broke the silence, the charm might go dormant, or worse, turn against you. Which is a polite way of saying, you might get boils, or diarrhea, or a demon in your soup. So people tried very hard to follow the rules. In short, activating a medieval charm was like installing a cursed IKEA cabinet, but with more livestock and existential dread. And yet, despite how utterly absurd most of these rituals seem to us now, spitting, whispering, burning, bleeding, they weren't jokes. They were acts of hope, of faith, of desperation. People wanted protection. They wanted security. They wanted something, anything, to keep their babies safe, their milk fresh, their dreams unhaunted. And if that meant sitting in a damp chapel whispering the name of St. George into a pebble wrapped in lamb's wool, so be it. Because what else did they have? No medicine, no therapists, no modern sanitation, no explanation for why bad things happened, just the endless fear of death, demons, and diarrhea. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself lying under the stars. You're wearing your charm. You've whispered your spell. Maybe you spit into the wind, just in case. And somewhere, in the distance, a cow moos approvingly. You're protected now. Probably. You wake up in a small stone room. There's a faint draft. Your bed is made of straw. The pillow is stuffed with what you hope is goose down, but might be hay and regret. Outside the window, a cock crows far too enthusiastically for how little sleep you've had. You sit up. You're sore. You're cold. And you're wearing a large iron ring engraved with strange symbols. It's pinching your finger a bit, but that's fine. Because this ring is magic. Or at least, that's what you were told. You were also told that bathing once a month was excessive and that leeches cure migraines. So, take it all with a grain of medieval salt, which was likely full of rat droppings and small rocks. Welcome to the world of enchanted jewelry, where nothing is subtle, everything has a secret purpose, and no one can agree on how any of it works. Let's begin with the classic, the ring of protection. Medieval rings weren't just status symbols or wedding bands, although yes, some were technically wedding rings, but usually gifted after a long dowry negotiation and several goats. These rings were talismans, shields, personalized armor for the superstitious soul. Take, for example, the ring of St. John. Supposedly, if you wore a ring blessed on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, it would protect you from seizures. But only if it was silver. And only if you wore it on your left ring finger. And only if you never took it off, not even while bathing, sleeping, or running from an angry pig. If you broke these rules, seizures. Instantly. Another crowd favorite? The toadstone ring. Toadstones, of course, are not stones at all. They are fossilized fish teeth, small, round, and completely non-magical. But medieval Europeans were absolutely convinced that they came from the heads of live toads. The ritual was very specific. You had to place a live toad on a red cloth under the full moon and wait for it to spit the stone out of its skull. Obviously, in practice, this never happened. But enterprising merchants didn't let a little thing like biology get in the way of a good scam, and they sold fish teeth labeled as genuine toadstones for a tidy sum. Set in silver or gold, these rings were set to protect against poison, plague, and bad dreams. Some believed the stone would heat up or change color if danger approached. Spoiler, it didn't. But it's not like anyone had a thermometer or a functioning scientific method, so people just assumed the ring wasn't working yet. Others believed in gemstone rings, not because of their sparkle, but because of what they supposedly did. For instance, amethyst would protect you from drunkenness. Garnet would heal infected wounds. Sapphire could cure boils and inward rot, which is probably as terrible as it sounds. Jet, a shiny black fossilized would guard against demons and make you more spiritually appealing. Like holy eyeliner. People genuinely believe that if you wore a sapphire on your middle finger while praying on a Thursday, your skin would clear up and your enemies would be vanquished. Or at least mildly inconvenienced. Oh, and rubies? Rubies were said to darken in color if you were in danger. Like a magical, stress-activated mood ring. Except the only real danger was the absurd price you paid for a gem someone found in a river and polished with goat fat. Before we get into more cursed objects and rings that were supposed to make you invisible, spoiler again, they didn't, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you somehow found comfort in this very slow, mildly sarcastic descent into historical nonsense. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching, and whether you're listening from a bed, a couch, or a cat-piled nest of blankets. I'm not judging. I envy you. Now, let's talk about ring inscriptions. Because why just wear a ring, when you can wear a ring that also tells demons to get lost? Some rings were carved with holy names, Yahweh, Jesus, Mary, or more obscure ones like Melchizedek, a priest-king from the Bible who apparently became very popular among ring collectors. These names were believed to radiate divine power. One ring, recovered from a 13th century grave, bears the phrase, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judorum. That's Latin for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the same inscription placed on the cross. Wearing this was like spiritual antivirus software. Other rings bore abbreviated psalms like PS91 or even secret angelic codes, strings of nonsense letters that were actually shorthand for protective prayers. Think of it like medieval CAPTCHA. There were also rings of invisibility. Did they work? Absolutely not. Did people believe in them? With all their muddy little hearts. These rings supposedly allowed the wearer to walk unseen, especially useful if you were a thief, a spy, or just someone who really didn't want to attend the feast of Saint Bernard again. In one 15th century story, a thief uses a ring of invisibility to sneak into a castle and steal a jewel-encrusted goblet. In another, a jealous suitor uses one to spy on his lover and her new fiancée. Spoiler, he still got caught. Possibly because invisibility doesn't help when you're loudly sobbing behind a curtain. Some of these rings were even said to vanish the wearer from the eyes of evil. But only if you were pure of heart. Which is a convenient way of saying, if it doesn't work, it's your fault. Let's move down to the necklaces. Necklaces in the medieval period were less fashion statements and more spiritual chainmail. One common item was the cross necklace, not as jewelry, but as a literal charm. People believed that wearing a cross that had been blessed by a priest, or better yet, touched to a relic, would guard your soul, your livestock, and your kidneys. Some necklaces had tiny scrolls tucked into them, rolled up parchment inscribed with prayers, invocations, or even recipes for spiritual protection. Think of it as wearing a fortune cookie around your neck, but one that says, you will not die of fever this week. And if you were really rich, you might wear a relic locket. This is exactly what it sounds like. A small, often jewel-studded container worn on a chain, inside of which was a fragment of a saint's bone, a shred of robe, or, if you were particularly lucky, a piece of their toenail. That's right. People wore tiny containers of holy toenails on their chests next to their hearts, because it was the medieval equivalent of an iPhone loaded with protection apps and low battery anxiety. Let's not forget brooches. These weren't just there to fasten your cloak. Brooches could be magical, too, especially if inscribed with sacred symbols or heraldic beasts. A lion brooch might give you courage. A snake could symbolize wisdom. A unicorn? Purity. Or at least an excellent sense of denial. Some brooches were made of iron, because iron was thought to repel evil spirits. Others were made from glass, shaped like gems, because not everyone could afford real stones and the demons didn't check receipts. And yes, there were brooches supposedly linked to invisibility. You'd pin it near your heart, whisper a short chant, in Latin, usually, spin around 3 times, and then walk boldly into town square hoping no one noticed your very visible self. Spoiler, they noticed. In other cases, charms were disguised as buttons or belt buckles. Some were even sewn into underwear. Because if you're going to carry spiritual protection, why not wear it where the sun and the devil don't shine? And speaking of underwear charms, some were designed to increase fertility. Others were for preventing nocturnal emissions, which were thought to attract demons. So yes, people wore anti-demon boxer shorts. Or at least, medieval linen equivalents. Possibly itchy. Almost certainly stained. It all leads to one deeply human conclusion. These people were scared. Of everything. And they responded the only way they knew how, by clinging to stuff. Jewelry. Stones. Inscriptions. The tangible. Because how else do you defend yourself against things you can't see? Against fate. Against illness. Against betrayal. Against the random cruelty of life. You wear a ring that says, Jesus loves me, and hope it's enough. You swallow a sapphire and pray your liver doesn't give out. You pin a lion brooch to your chest and pretend you're not terrified. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, maybe wearing a ring, maybe not, remember this, you're not so different from them. A little scared. A little hopeful. Still chasing protection in the shape of something shiny. You wake up in a field. There's mud on your boots. Something squishy under your elbow. Probably a frog. Or a potato. Or a potato-shaped frog. You sit up, dazed, and realize you're surrounded by grave markers and patches of scorched earth. You are in a medieval cemetery at dawn. You are clutching a pouch full of teeth. Not yours. Welcome to one of the least advertised facts of medieval life. Sometimes, the charm that protected you yesterday is the one that'll curse your descendants today. Yes, we're talking about the strange and strangely common practice of ritual disposal. When amulets, charms, and magical objects had outlived their usefulness, or worse, when people believed they had turned against them, those objects had to be disposed of carefully. Not thrown in the trash. Not tossed in the fire with the leftover sheep bones. No, you had to ritually burn it, or bury it, or dissolve it in holy water, or, if you were really fancy, mail it to a monastery and let the monks deal with it like some kind of medieval customer service hotline for cursed jewelry. So let's begin with the obvious. Why burn something that was supposed to help you? Because in the medieval mind, magic was never just decoration. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal. That charm against fever? It didn't represent safety. It was the actual thing keeping you alive. And if it started to fail, if your fever got worse, or the charm cracked, or someone with a greasy mustache looked at you funny while pointing at it, well, that charm might now be the problem. In medieval terms, that's the equivalent of your iPhone developing sentience and deciding you're annoying. Time to yeet it into the fire. Of course, not all charms were evil gone wrong. Some were made to be temporary from the start, single-use magic. Like a medieval band-aid, but written in Latin and probably containing hair. For example, if you wore a piece of parchment inscribed with a prayer during childbirth and survived, you weren't supposed to keep it. No. You were supposed to burn it immediately. Why? Because using it again might attract evil, or dilute the magic, or confuse the spiritual energy, which would then presumably misfire and strike the wrong uterus. So many medieval households had a little ritual fire corner, not for warmth, but for disposing of magical objects. Usually supervised by someone's great-aunt, who'd whisper nonsense syllables and throw salt into the flames like she was seasoning a demonic stew. And speaking of salt, yes, salt was often used in these disposals. Burn the object, then throw salt on the ashes to cleanse the site. This also guaranteed that no one would be stupid enough to try and recycle your old charm. Because that was a thing. Imagine living in a world where someone might dig up a burnt amulet, slap it on their wrist, and then complain when it gives them boils. Now, let's get into burial. Because while burning was dramatic, burial was safer, especially if you suspected the object was haunted, cursed, or just weird in that way objects get when they've absorbed too many sickbed whispers. Some charms, especially love charms or fertility objects, were buried under thresholds, behind doors, or near wells. Why? Because if the magic didn't work for you, maybe it would still work for the house. Let the house fall in love. Or get pregnant. Who knows? Or, more commonly, burying a charm was meant to trap the magic underground, so it couldn't leak out and, say, infect the local ducks. Because you do not want a cursed duck. Some burial rituals were incredibly specific. One medieval manual advises, wrap the charm in black cloth, sprinkle it with ash and vinegar, and bury it beneath the hawthorn tree under the waning moon. Then spit 3 times and walk away without looking back. This is either a spell or a recipe for disappointing salad dressing. Either way, it's complicated. And let's not forget well disposal. Yes, people threw charms into wells, which is extra gross when you consider that everyone also drank from those wells. But logic was not medieval Europe's strong suit. The reasoning went like this: water purifies. So if you drop your cursed object in water, especially holy water or running spring water, it'll dissolve the magic. What it usually did, instead, was sink, where it stayed, forever. Which is why modern archaeologists keep finding amulets, bones, and tiny shoes at the bottom of medieval wells like some sort of supernatural thrift store. Then there's the practice of walling up charms. Yes, people would literally hide them inside walls, behind plaster, under floorboards, inside chimney flues. Not because they were embarrassed, but because they believed the location mattered. You don't just want to destroy the object. You want to trap its power in a place where it can't hurt anyone, but might still keep the mice away. There are records of people walling up dead cats, mummified birds, and baby shoes with prayers written on them. Imagine moving into a charming 14th century cottage, knocking down a wall, and discovering a very flat feline staring into your soul. Welcome home. And if burning, burying, drowning, or walling wasn't enough, you could disenchant a charm. This was a specialized task. You had to take the object to a wise woman or a cunning man, or, if you were rich and deeply nervous, a local priest who charged by the hour. Disenchanting involved a process called unmaking. You'd untie knots, reverse inscriptions, chant prayers backwards, always a classy choice, and sometimes smash the object on an altar. Because nothing says spiritual closure like breaking a rock with your bare hands while sobbing about how your love spell didn't work. And yes, people cried over this stuff. Because these charms weren't just superstitions. They were investments. Emotional ones. Physical ones. Sometimes literal coin-based ones. People spent real money, real time, real hope on these objects. And when they failed, it hurt. Sometimes they failed spectacularly, like the charm you wore to protect your marriage right before your spouse ran off with your cousin in Three Chic. Or the amulet that was supposed to keep your crops healthy right before the hailstorm obliterated your barley and half your faith in God. When that happened, the charm became a symbol of betrayal. And betrayal, in the Middle Ages, was personal. So people responded like you might when deleting an ex's number. They destroyed the thing. Viciously. Emotionally. Often loudly. And if you couldn't bring yourself to destroy it, you might pass it on to someone else. Quietly. In a bag, with a whispered warning and a shrug. Sort of like, hey, this might protect you. Or ruin your life. Good luck. Because ultimately, the line between magic and cursed junk in medieval Europe was razor thin. Sometimes a charm helped. Sometimes it harmed. Sometimes it just sat there gathering mold. But people kept believing. They wore charms, prayed over them, hid them, burned them, buried them, flushed them, and sometimes even ate them. Yes, ingesting magic was a thing, but we'll save that nightmare buffet for Chapter 9. Tonight, as you drift off, hopefully without cursed objects under your mattress, think about the strange comfort these charms must have brought, and the strange fear they sometimes inspired. Because even in the sleepiest corners of history, the human urge to believe in something more, to hold it, hide it, burn it, bury it, it never really goes away. And as your eyes close and the night settles around you like a heavy wool cloak that smells vaguely of sheep and candle wax, remember this. There are hundreds of forgotten charms still hidden in the walls of medieval houses. Still watching. Still waiting. Still whispering. You wake up with something gritty in your teeth. You blink. You're in a candlelit chamber with stone walls, a sloped wooden ceiling, and the faint smell of rotting herbs and recently plucked feathers. You try to sit up, but a sharp pain in your side suggests you've been recently bled, cupped, or possibly beaten by a sanctified stick. Your tongue feels weird. There's something under it. You lift it. There it is, a tiny scrap of parchment, inscribed with a Latin prayer, and possibly, just possibly, written in chicken blood. Congratulations. You've just survived a medieval medical intervention. And your prescription? Swallow one charm with water. Repeat until divine mercy is achieved. Yes. Swallow. The whole thing. Because in the grand, strange, moldy logic of medieval healing, putting something inside your body especially if it was once blessed, inscribed, or stuck to a piece of animal, was believed to draw healing from the divine, or at least confuse the disease into leaving out of pure alarm. So, let's begin where all bad decisions begin, gemstones. You might be thinking, oh, shiny rocks. They probably wore those around their necks. And they did. But sometimes they ate them, crushed, dissolved in wine, or simply swallowed whole like magical aspirin. Ever wondered what a medieval cure for epilepsy might involve? A 13th century text recommends the following: crush a sapphire, yes, an actual sapphire, mix it with mother's milk, and drink it on an empty stomach during a full moon. This was not a prank. This was considered cutting-edge medicine. And if sapphire was too pricey, no worries. You could use garnet, topaz, amethyst, or, if you really wanted results, bezoars. Ah yes, the bezoar. Nature's weirdest multi-tool. A bezoar is a stone-like mass found in the stomach of certain animals, usually goats or cows. It's formed from undigested fur, food, and other materials, packed together like a little internal lint ball. In the medieval world, it was prized. People believed bezoars could neutralize poison. Swallow one, and boom, immunity. Like medieval EpiPens, but hairier. Of course, not everyone could afford goat stomach stones. Some had to make do with crushed pearls, powdered coral, or, and I wish I were kidding, burnt hedgehog spines mixed with wine. This is the part of history where someone definitely should have said, "Have you tried not eating that?" But no one did. Because the logic of ingestion was spiritual as much as it was physical. The body, in medieval thinking, was a container, not just of blood and guts, but of mystical channels. Disease? That was a spiritual blockage. Sin made manifest. And just as prayers could cleanse the soul, sacred substances could cleanse the body. Hence, holy charms were eaten. Some were made for this. Small wafers inscribed with prayers. Parchment slips with protective words. Even lead tablets etched with divine names, although, fun fact, lead is poison. Did that stop anyone? No. Because apparently, dying of lead poisoning was still preferable to dying of demonic possession. Or gout. Or humor imbalance, which could be anything from a headache to full body rotting. So what did people eat in the name of protection? Let's make a list. Because lists help keep the existential horror contained. 1. Holy texts on parchment. A small prayer, written by a priest, rolled up tightly and swallowed during illness. Usually with wine. Or, if you were extra devout, holy water. It was believed that the words, literal divine speech, would enter your body and act as antibiotics from God. Did it work? No. But did people think it worked? Sometimes. Especially when they didn't immediately die. 2. Metals. Not just lead, although that was popular, but also gold, silver, and iron, either shaved into powder or heated into a liquid, then added to drinks. This was especially common for conditions thought to involve cold humors, depression, fatigue, or general lifelessness. Because what better way to add vitality than swallowing a little sun-colored bling? Iron, interestingly, was also considered protective against witchcraft. So swallowing an iron shaving was sort of like taking out an anti-curse insurance policy. One that tasted like blood and tetanus. 3. Animal products. Hair, bone, fat. Yes, all of it. Hair from a blessed animal, particularly a lamb born on Easter, was believed to have curative properties. Chew it while praying, and you might recover from fever. Bone dust, especially saint bones, was the medieval version of protein powder. But divine. And then there's fat. Bear fat. Goose fat. Badger fat. Often eaten raw. Sometimes rubbed on the chest while reciting Psalm 23. Because if it was good enough for job, it's good enough for your weird medieval rash. 4. Human remains. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. Yes, mummy dust was a thing. Imported from Egypt, ground down into powder, and mixed into treatments for everything from headaches to broken limbs. Because in the deeply cursed logic of medieval Europe, if they lasted this long, their body must be powerful. Also popular, blood from executed criminals. Warm. Drunk fresh. 4. Epilepsy. You're welcome. 5. Feather-based charms. Particularly from owls, roosters, or doves. Owl feathers represented wisdom and night protection. Dove feathers were linked to purity. Roosters, apparently, just had vibes. These feathers were sometimes burned and the ashes eaten, or just eaten whole, which I assume led to some uncomfortable mornings involving very confused bowel movements and divine regrets. 6. Stones blessed by priests. Known as phylacteries, these were small engraved stones, usually bearing the name of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or some angel that may or may not be canonical. People wore them, but also, occasionally, swallowed them. Not always voluntarily. There are records of priests forcibly making patients ingest phylacteries, especially during possessions. The idea being, if you can't get the demon to leave, maybe you can stuff so much holy energy in the body that it just runs out of room. And if the patient choked to death? Well, at least they died spiritually cleansed. Now let's talk about delivery methods. Because medieval people didn't just chew on relics like potato chips. They got creative. Suspensions in wine. Everything goes down easier with alcohol. Especially powdered lapis lazuli. Wrapped in bread. If your holy charm is bitter, just swallow it like a spiritual vitamin sandwich. Dissolved in holy water. For that extra divine kick. Please ignore the floating hair and be carcasses. It's fine. Under the tongue dissolve. Like magical cough drops. Except with more mercury. And here's the kicker, not everyone did this for healing. Some did it for protection. Imagine, you're heading to war. You want to be safe. Do you pray? Sure. Wear armor? Obviously. But also, you swallow a tiny charm with the names of saints etched on it. So that, no matter what happens, the saints are literally inside you. Internal patron saints. Digestible courage. Holy indigestion. There are even records of lovers swapping charms to swallow. The most disturbing version of romantic tokens imaginable. Here, darling, eat this bone chip from a blessed monk. I engraved our initials on it. Now, did this work? Objectively, no. Most of these ingestible charms did nothing but make people feel spiritually secure while absolutely ravaging their intestines. But subjectively, some people survived. And survival in the Middle Ages wasn't just luck, it was proof. If you lived, the charm worked. If you died, well, maybe you swallowed the wrong prayer. So people kept doing it, over and over again. Because when life is full of plagues, wars, famine, and surprise goat attacks, you cling to what you can. Even if what you're clinging to is a nugget of burned pigeon feather wrapped in scripture and soaked in red wine. As you drift off tonight, let this be your lullaby. People once swallowed charms made of iron, feathers, gemstones, and medieval Latin. They did it with hope and fear, and possibly while gagging violently behind the haystack. And that's both tragic and kind of beautiful. Because belief is a powerful thing, even when it tastes like chalk dust and regret. You wake up in the straw-stuffed corner of a narrow wooden house. The room smells like wax, old sweat, and rose petals that have absolutely seen better centuries. A single candle flickers on a shelf above your head. You sit up and realize you're not alone. There's a small wax doll on the table across from you. It has hair glued to its head, real hair, from a real human, possibly your crush, possibly some guy named Jeff. There's Latin scribbled across its stomach. Its eyes are stitched shut. And next to it, a packet of herbs, some red thread, and a suspicious stain on the table that might be wine, blood, or last week's regret. Congratulations. You're in the middle of a medieval love spell. And you're not the only one. Because in a time before Tinder, therapy, or basic emotional literacy, medieval people turned to charms, talismans, and magical manipulation to attract love, keep love, or, when necessary, utterly ruin someone's harvest out of romantic spite. Let's begin with the most desperate demographic, unmarried women over the age of 17. Also known in some towns as suspiciously single witches. Medieval society put a lot of pressure on women to get married. Early, preferably while still bleeding from their first period and before they grew opinions. If you weren't married by your late teens, people got nervous. Because clearly, something was wrong. Possibly morally. Possibly demonically. So young women turned to love charms. Some were simple. Sleep with a rosemary sprig under your pillow, and the man you dream of will be your husband. Unless you dreamed of two men, in which case, someone called a bishop. Others were more elaborate. Like writing the name of your desired partner on a piece of bread soaked in wine, wrapping it in red thread, and burying it under their doorstep while reciting a prayer to Saint Agnes, patron saint of virgins, awkward crushes, and help me, I'm panicking in public. And some were deeply cursed. There's a 14th century French charm that instructs the reader to write a love spell using menstrual blood, smear it on a piece of parchment, fold it into a heart, and hide it in the saddle of your beloved's horse. Because apparently nothing says romance like body fluids and saddle rash. Men weren't immune to this nonsense either. Desperate bachelors had their own tools, usually involving herbs, bones, or animal parts. Want to seduce a maiden? Try carrying a dried weasel's testicle in your boot. Or better yet, wear a necklace made from the left foot of a hare, killed during a full moon. It's worth noting that at no point did anyone suggest just talk to her and be nice. Now, let's take a short but intimate detour into the medieval aphrodisiac aisle. Forget chocolate and oysters. We're talking ground-up beetle wings mixed with honey to stimulate passion and your gag reflex. Basil leaves soaked in goat's milk for fertility. Applied topically. Yes, there. Powdered viper's heart, consumed with wine to inspire vigorous urges. Side effects may include hallucinations and death. You know it's serious when the love potion has a higher body count than the bubonic plague. And if these home remedies didn't work, you could hire a professional spellcaster, usually a village-wise woman, midwife, or ex-nun who had seen some things and would, for the right fee, prepare a bespoke emotional ambush. One recipe from a 15th century grimoire recommends writing your beloved's name on the inside of an egg, blowing out the yolk, stuffing it with lavender, and burying it under a hawthorn tree while chanting the psalms backward. Did it work? Sometimes. But more often, your crush just married someone else, and you were left with an empty egg, a basil rash, and a criminal record for trespassing. Now, let's talk about relationship maintenance. Because once you had your partner, you had to keep them. And in a world without couples therapy, most people turn to either divine intervention or hexes. There were amulets designed to prevent infidelity, typically worn around the neck or sewn into a pillow. Some were inscribed with the names of angels, others with the phrase bound in flesh and love, written in Latin, Greek, or your best attempt at either. Want to keep your husband from wandering? A popular German charm recommended putting a lock of your own hair into his left boot. If he strayed, he'd be cursed with impotence. A more ambitious wife might sneak menstrual blood into his wine, not to seduce, but to bind. Blood magic was considered incredibly potent and extremely unsanitary. But it was the Tinder super-like of its time. As for divorce, it technically wasn't a thing. But you could perform separation rituals. A 13th century Italian text contains a breakup charm involving 3 pigeons, a black candle, and a mirror. You light the candle, stab the mirror with a needle, and whisper your ex's name 9 times while turning slowly counterclockwise. Allegedly, this would make them fall in love with someone else. Or at least experience sudden and inexplicable onion breath forever. Still bitter? You could escalate to agricultural revenge. Yes, really. People believed that by burying cursed charms in someone's field, you could destroy their crops, and with them, their social standing, marriage prospects, and emotional stability. Common breakup hexes included binding poppets made of wax and pig's hair, inscribed bones tucked under root vegetables, turnips carved with insults, then blessed by a disreputable monk and left in your ex's well. These were not isolated incidents. Court records from across Europe are full of people being accused of love sorcery, usually women, but sometimes jilted men who had clearly spent too long whispering at a cabbage. Now, we can't talk about this without addressing the church. The church hated all of this. Love spells were explicitly forbidden. Using charms to seduce, bind, or curse a lover was considered sinful, even if you used Latin and lit a candle from a holy altar. It didn't matter if your intentions were romantic. If you tampered with free will, you were playing God. Or worse, playing the devil. That didn't stop anyone. But it did lead to some of the most passive-aggressive sermons in history. Priests regularly preached against those who keep relics of lust, who bind others with blood, or who utter the psalms for carnal purposes. To be fair, that does sound like a great band name. Even pilgrimages got romantic. You'd think people would walk 400 miles to see a saint's finger for spiritual growth. But no, some did it hoping to be cured of unrequited love. Or better yet, to find a husband at the shrine. Nothing like meeting someone while weeping over a toenail of Saint Margaret. There are accounts of women tying ribbons to statues while praying for a spouse. Others left locks of hair, rings, or even undergarments, a sort of spiritual dating profile, blessed by divine intervention and mild desperation. And when love actually worked, when people married, well, they still carried charms. For fertility, for peaceful homes, and sometimes just to make sure their in-laws didn't hex them out of jealousy. One popular charm involved sewing 7 grains of wheat into your wedding clothes. Another involved wearing a toad's foot on a chain during your wedding night to promote virility and reduce the likelihood of excessive talking. I'm not sure that last part worked, but it's a charming effort. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe picture a young woman in 1357, standing in the moonlight, clutching a jar of basil and a stolen chicken feather, whispering her beloved's name while trying not to sneeze. Or a lonely merchant in 1423, swallowing a sapphire with a prayer because the girl he likes keeps making eye contact with someone else at Mass. Or 2 lovers exchanging charms before a journey, not rings, but tiny wax hearts, inscribed with trembling words and tied with crimson thread. It's messy. It's weird. It's kind of gross. But it's love. Medieval style. And that, my friend, is the most irrational magic of all.